Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Mariam Zaidi, and welcome to EURACTIV Hybrid Conference supported by Microsoft. Now, today is the closing for a series that has been exploring where European democracy is at and where it needs to be. The theme for our discussion today is democratic values in the digital age. How can tech companies reinforce and strengthen European democracy? A big welcome to our in-person audience and to everyone who is joining us online. Now, today is a little bit different to our usual blueprint. After some opening remarks, we're actually going to have 3 panel discussions across the 3 themes of EDAP, the European Democracy Action Plan. So strengthening media freedom, promoting free and fair elections, and countering disinformation. Now, each panel is going to be 20 minutes long, and we will also be taking your questions. So there's a lot of content to get through. But also, we obviously want everyone to, as always, get involved. So send in your questions or your comments into Slido, the app, and we'll be picking those out for later on in the program and during every panel discussion, time permitting. And talking of time, what a timely debate we're having today. European democracy is under attack. These aren't my words. These are the words of the European Parliament President Roberta Metsola. As Qatargate, the bribe scandal consuming the European Parliament, heats up, it's just another reminder that power and influence cannot be unbridled. It needs to be checked. It needs to be held up to account. Europe has many tools in which to fight it, to fight the injustice, but can it clean house? All puns intended, but obviously disclaimer, innocent until proven guilty. Now, over the last few months, Microsoft has led a series of discussions on democratic values in the digital age, which brought together civil society, academia, legislative, and tech to reflect on the direction of European democracy and the role that tech can play in advancing democratic norms, using the EDAP as a guide for all conversation. And a partner from each of these discussions is going to actually join our panelists, albeit virtually, to discuss the given topic or theme. Well, to learn more, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Nana Louise Lind, the Vice President of European Government Affairs at Microsoft.
Thank you so much, and welcome, everyone. Welcome to our panelists and the audience here and the audience online. Very happy to host you here at Microsoft. As we heard already from our dear moderator, democracies are under pressure and democratic values are under pressure. Democracies in the world are declining. The amount is declining where they should be rising. Democratic values are under pressure. I think the war in Ukraine is one symbol of this. Disinformation, as you mentioned, is on the rise. Journalists are threatened more than ever, being surveyed, investigated by their own governments. As we have seen from the series here, and also what we found in our report on what we learned from the Ukraine war so far, these bad actors undermine entire democratic processes. And digital technology does play a role as a weapon. On the other hand, it can also serve as a tool to protect democratic values. So that plays that puts technology companies in a very important role and with a very important responsibility. And we can help in different ways, help combat misinformation. We can build tools to protect democratic values and processes, elections. And we've done a lot already at Microsoft. We've done a lot of work in Ukraine. We have built tools and services that help governments protect their elections. We are training journalists and governments in these tools and process and services. And we're also an active supporter of some of the initiatives from the Commission, European Democratic Action Plan. But there's probably more that we can do, and more that we should learn to understand our responsibility. And I think that's why, this series has been really helpful, also for us to understand better and hear other voices than our own. So we're really a proud supporter of this initiative, and I want to take the opportunity to thank EURACTIV for organizing this event and kick off these series. Our partners, University College Dublin, Globsec in Bratislava, Central European Digital Media Observatory in Prague, for organizing these workshops, and looking very much forward to their findings, the outcomes of those workshops. Hope we can learn from them. My final thanks go to you as the moderator and the panelists, and I'm going to hand the mic back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those comments. Thank you so much. Okay, well, with that, Mr. Wojciech Talko, please do take the floor. He is, of course, a member of the Cabinet of EU Commissioner for Values and Transparency, Vera Jourova. Please give us your opening thoughts and keynote speech.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I appreciate that you decided to spend a Wednesday evening here with us in the room and also online. I mean, I have roughly 10 minutes, right? So I will try to essentially, I have one goal. I want to ask you for help. Because we talk about democracy, and I cannot disagree with anything that was already said before, but there's no one institution, one company, one person that will defend it. Democracy is us, our institutions, our votes, our civil society activism, and we all have to play our role in this if we want to uphold it and protect it. There's no doubt democracy is under threat. No doubt. We see it in the US, which is, apparently has the best checks and balances. We see it in Europe. And I have a feeling that at least in Europe, for a long period of time, democracy was seen as perpetuum mobile. I'm from Poland. Our democracy is from '89, so relatively young. But even then, the 90s, the early 2000s, it was like everything will take care of itself. I think it's clear the answer to this is no, it won't. Either we fight for it, or it will be lost. I work for Vice President Vera Jourova, who is Czech, so I wouldn't be allowed to leave that room without quoting Václav Havel. So let me just very briefly read his quote, because I mean it's bad. He's very eloquent, me not so much. So I better read it because to give the true meaning to what he wanted to say. And he wrote, "The natural disadvantage of democracy is that it's extremely tiring to those who mean it honestly, while it allows almost everything to those who do not take it seriously." I mean, my interpretation of this, that democracy is messy, it's complicated, and it's not that easy even for the people to fully embrace it and defend it, because I think that's the question. If we say we want to defend democracy, what is it that we actually want to defend? And there are many elements. I won't dwell into that too much, but I think, first of all, it's the voters, right? In democracy, it's the voters that have their ultimate arbiters of which political party, which leaders are supposed to govern, what values they're supposed to represent. And it's our job, I think, as the European institution, as the European Commission, to make sure that there's this level playing field, that the voters can take their decisions in the best possible information environment, having the best information available, trustworthy information, and can take free decision, or as free as they can possibly be. And for that to happen, the system of checks and balances have to work. And I mean, I'm sure you know what I mean. It's the free media, independent media, pluralistic media, independent courts. It's peaceful transition of power, free and fair elections, among many other things. And I want to be clear about it, because our actions, that I will say briefly a few words in a second, is not about ideology. It's not about being left-wing or right-wing. It's about, for the left-wing or right-wing people competing fairly on the democratic scene. And I really want to thank you to EURACTIV, to Microsoft, to all other partners who are organizing this event and these panels, because when I look at the three titles of the panels, it's essentially the pillars also of the European Democracy Action Plan. So I take it that we also did something right, at least with this plan. And I trust the panels will go into details. But so let me stress. Let me start by stressing the media, because this was something that I think this commission has really taken seriously. Before, the approach to media was, it's an economic sector. Yes, it is. There is a lot of private sector, a lot of money involved. Let's not touch it. It's a sector as many others, so competition rules apply, but no special treatment. We have departed from that. Why? Because media is not economic sector as any other. They're an essential pillar of democracy. They're the fourth estate, and without pluralistic, trustworthy media, we simply, as voters, have hard time getting right information. And again, it's not about saying which information is right or wrong. It's about creating the conditions where the media and journalists can do their job. So we have done, I think we have advanced this agenda, and we're building the European layer of supporting media freedom and pluralism. Let me just mention from recently we have adopted in September, we have proposed the European Media Freedom Act. This is already a controversial proposal, let me put it this way. What we try to do there, we really try to address the problems that we see. So from our perspective, it's extremely practical. And it's a very common sense approach. We don't dictate how member states should design their media systems. We say maybe no party friends should be the bosses of public TV stations. We say there should be, we say also we're talking about tech, so let's say that we should also, the social media platforms should pay more attention to the content, editorial content provided by the media. Because this is, this freedom of speech debate. Like, should the platforms have the right to assess the content of the media, which, on the one hand, DSA tells them to do so, but on the other hand, we have to be very clear that this content should be treated differently, right? So we also want to make sure that when there are there are mergers and acquisitions of media companies, that it's not only a business transaction from the view of the regulator when they assess it, but it's also a pluralism test. Because it's not good if majority of the media are owned by the same person or by the same organization, whether it's private or public. So, even though it's common sense, some countries, some stakeholders have a problem with it. Of course, this is, our opening gambit, and will be working with the Council and the Parliament and with stakeholders to get it right. But I think, the one thing that I want to say is it's really needed. It's really needed, and the answer, because we've never done it and we shouldn't touch it, is just not good enough and not ambitious enough for the times we live in, The second pillar of the European Democracy Action Plan, which is really, I think, the first time the Commission tried to put comprehensive response and show that we have to work on we have to play on many instruments at the same time if we want to strengthen resilience of democracy, is disinformation. I mean, now, of course, the Russian war in Ukraine have accelerated everything. Everything comes to the light, and we can see very clearly, I think, what especially many countries in Central and Eastern Europe were saying for a long time. Russia is weaponizing information. What they're doing, they not only fight with bombs and rockets, they also fight with words. They've always done so, but they've gained new tools, digital tools. I'm not saying that this is intended, of course, by the social media companies, because that's not the point. They did it they tried to use traditional media before, but they have gained vast array of new powerful tools, because younger generations are more and more sourcing the information about the world they see from online media. And we can see it on the example of Russia, but it's not only Russia, of course, that they intentionally manipulate information space and platform features to undermine free speech. The challenge to this is how to find a democratic response to authoritarian weapon. And I think, you saw our response. Our response is European Democracy Action Plan. It's the legislation like the Digital Services Act. It's the legislation like Political Ads regulation. But it's also non-legislative actions like Code of Practice on Disinformation. And so that's why we have to really take it seriously. The codes, it's, I think, by the 16th, the signatories, including Microsoft, thank you very much for signing up. They have time till the 16th to implement it, and January will be really a test case, because this will become public, and we can discuss in details what that means. Let me just, the final words, because this is also not only what we have done, but also what we will do. So we've started work on defense of democracy package, which also is supposed to be a legislation on transparency on foreign funding. Maybe some relevance also to what you talked about in the context of the Qatargate that we're seeing. Of course, it's not going to solve all the problems, but I think it gains new relevance in that light. So this is, because this is also important for us, that events like this and everything that happens in the weeks and months to come, we're filling this defense of democracy package with substance now. So we need ideas, we need creative ideas. This will be also a revision of the European Democracy Action Plan. So we haven't done something, or we've done something not good enough. This is the time to tell us. We have a few months together to put together a substantial package, legislative and non-legislative, because just in the timing of the political life we live in Brussels, this is probably the last push of this Commission, substantial push, especially when it comes to legislation, because then, of course, we need time for the Parliament and the Council to agree. So the plan is the second quarter, around May probably, but I haven't touched upon many other things, cybersecurity, resilience, and other things, but we can explore these things together with colleagues in the panel. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for organizing this, and I'm looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please do join us back. Okay, well, you heard from Mr. Wojciech Talko there. He was talking about how we all need to fight for democracy, and indeed we do. But who is also fighting to influence all of us, the voter? Now, the online world, of course, influences so much of what we do, whether it's socially, democratically, and politically. Human behavior can be easily manipulated by online content. Carefully curated algorithms, of course, based on what we seem to like, maximize our engagement and help form our ideas, our opinions. Now, social media is, of course, fodder also for misinformation. Mr. Wojciech was also alluding to Russia's manipulation war in its war in Ukraine. Many platforms, of course, have been accused of using misinformation and lots of allegations against them for the harm that misinformation, of course, causes and the lies that it then allows to spread. Now, the biggest impact is perhaps the influence that social media platforms have on forming our politics and who we decide to vote for, or the causes that we then believe in or take up. Now, just now, over in the US, bipartisan legislation could outright ban one of the biggest apps right now, TikTok. It would ban it outright in the US. They say it's a threat to national security. Is that approach right? Well, the EU is always armed with tools to help regulate and navigate the internet, along with things like EDAP. We have the Digital Services Act. Now, the EU Commission, as Mr. Talko mentioned, is also trying to help along democracy with things like the Defense of Democracy package. We saw Ursula von der Leyen, of course, unveil it, draped in the Ukrainian flag. But is the gap between rhetoric and reality painfully obvious today? or are we actually closing that gap? Well, without further ado, you've already heard from Mr. Talco. Let's introduce our other panelists. We have Louise Grabo, who's the President of the Observatory of the Digital Transition and the Single Market at the European Social and Economic Committee. Welcome. We also have Fernanda Hotel Foronda, who's a Digital Policy Officer at the European Partnership for Democracy. And as I mentioned, an online panelist will be joining us per panel debate, so do watch out for them as well. And to all the everyone in the audience here and online, do put your questions into Slido. Okay, with that, let me now go over to Louise for your opening comments.
Thank you so much, and thank you, EURACTIV and Microsoft, for having me here. As you mentioned, I'm the chair or the president for the Digital and Single Market Observatory in the European Economic and Social Committee. And what we are doing are that we're looking more into new technologies and how that affect the EU, but also the civil society and the society as a whole. So we do a lot of discussions and panels and information about AI, blockchain, big data, cloud, and all these things. So that is where I come from, and I'm from Sweden, and there I also work with fintech, so I'm also into this tech world. So there are my perspectives from today. And when speaking about new technologies, a new technology could never be bad or good. A new technology is always neutral, and the ones behind it, that can be a threat or harm anyone. But I would never say that a new technology in itself could be bad or good. And I think it's the same with social media and tech companies. Social media could be very powerful. We've seen CEOs from different social medias that are maybe having more powers than any politician in the EU or any member state. And we should be aware of this, of course. But at the same time, there's not an option for the EU to try to create their own super app or super social media. This should be up to the market because the new innovations come from the market, and we will always see new social media and always new tech companies coming up. But what are the values that we want to see online? I think this is what we should focus on. And of course, we want to see free speech. We want to see safe platforms where young people, where kids actually at, so there should be some kind of a safe space. And we should, of course, promote competition on the market so we see new companies coming up. And this is some of the first words in this panel that I will say now, and I hopefully come back to some of them and get to say something more later on. But thank you.
Thank you so much. I think safety and competition are two important themes that we will discuss later. Please, over to you for next.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much to Microsoft and to EURACTIV. I would suggest that companies, including big tech, do actually play a very limited proactive role in the EDAP. Other than, of course, the EDAP, the measures there and the measures that the EDAP really implies or that underpin EDAP, which are the European Media Freedom Act and the DSA, of course, create obligations for online platforms and others. But just to try to enrich the discussion coming afterwards, I would suggest that there are a couple areas that are not exactly the core of the EDAP, but that are around the EDAP, where actually tech companies can play a role to reinforce and strengthen democracy in the EU. The first one was something that it's very interesting, and here I must disagree on the idea that it's exclusively the market that creates social media. The market creates them, regulations shape them, and that's the self-government principle. A democratic society is entitled to define how services are provided in that society. And something that the European Union has certainly done is to impose upon very large online platforms the obligation to assess risks, not only to fundamental rights, but also to civic discourse and to electoral processes, stemming from very large online platforms, most notably social media. And there are provisions on involving civil society and researchers in identifying these risks and identifying the mitigation actions that need to be taken. But this is not very clear to many exactly how this will be taken into account, how public the process is, which structure does this have. And here I do think that big tech has a possibility to act in good faith and take in the expertise, the evidence, and the suggestions that civil society brings in. So that's the first point. Second, also staying in the DSA, access to data. So something that has been mandated in the DSA in Article 40, vetted researchers must have access and be able to scrutinize data by very large online platforms. Many researchers have been slapped in the past when trying to access data. They have ended up having to give up their research projects. Their universities have the funding by big tech to some of their universities has been withheld. We have experienced all of this in the past. Something to hope for is that access to data and scrutiny of data happens indeed in a smooth manner, as mandated in the DSA. Third, in the DSA, we really have a lot on recommender systems, and I must thank the Commission very much for the proposal that was put forward, which I think was strengthened through the legislative process, but essentially there we have the proposal by the Commission. And we have a large degree of transparency and a certain degree of informed choice by the user on the recommender systems. But here I think there is room for more. And often the debate, we have already seen it here, often the debate on the responsibility on platforms gravitates around content moderation, so direct actions on specific items of content. But we have a much more structural key factor for democracies, that it's content curation. So I wouldn't care so much that a specific news article is taken down off Facebook, but whether Facebook algorithms makes that news articles have less visibility in general because they are less engaging, and then people will stay less time on the platform using it. This, I think, is a greater threat to democracy because this results in people being less informed and then having less informed choices. So I think there is a lot of room in the area of how content is curated in general and how relevant information it's demoted or not. One issue, Wojtek was mentioning the initiative on political ads. We know that some platforms are very bad at identifying when an ad is political or not. And in this digitalization that we're experiencing, ads used to be political ads, political campaigns happened on the radio, TV, newspapers, billboards. And there, whichever company had a billboard and an ad would go there, they would have to check whether it was political or not and comply with electoral law. This doesn't seem to be very much this case. We have the research by the New York University Center for Cyber and researchers at the Catholic University of Leuven showing that Facebook identifies 3 false negatives as political ads for each political ad that it actually gets right. But we also have the information that across the world, this ratio is very different. So it shows that when big tech puts resources to correctly identify political ads, voila, they happen to be correctly identified. So this is somewhere where big tech really has room for improvement, dedicating resources to ensure that ads that happen to be political are correctly identified, and indeed obligations that will come from the political ads regulation will then kick in. One last point where we see action taken recently as per an interview given by Commissioner Reinders to EURACTIV last week. There will be apparently some work in relation to dark patterns and cookie banners. We understand that understanding privacy as each individual's ability to just disclose information about themselves under their own control, it's a precondition of democracy. Because in a country where citizens' lives are not private, democracy is essentially not possible. And there is probably room to rely on genuine consent. We have recent decisions taken by the EDPB in relation to conditions under which personal data can be processed. Looking at legislative action likely coming up, a public consultation open already on online fairness, digital fairness initiative, if I recall correctly, we have room for improvement in how to genuinely and validly gather consent from data subjects before and while processing their personal data.
Okay. Thank you so much, Fernando. Okay, well, let's kick off the first discussion then, and we are talking about media freedom and pluralism. I invite Eugenia Ciapera, who's the Professor of Information and Communication Studies at the University College Dublin, to our conversation. She, of course, joins remotely. You can see her on your screens. Please start us off with your key recommendations. 1 minute, please, maximum. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Contemporary news media are locked in a symbiotic, albeit unequal and occasionally antagonistic relationship with the state and digital platforms. Media freedom and pluralism requires that states clarify and sharpen the meaning of pluralism, demarcating its contours and offering protections from state overreach. Platforms, on the other hand, should support news media and journalism's important social and political functions, even if on occasion this may interfere with their business models and bottom lines. Also, I would like to add that certain forms of journalism that are necessary for democracy, for example, investigative journalism, should be systematically supported, even if they are not commercially profitable. Attention should be paid to the working conditions of journalists, especially on precarity, potentially dangerous assignments, and long shifts, as all of this may compromise journalism.
Okay, thank you so much. Very snappy. Okay, Wojciech, your reaction then to what Eugenia said, and also perhaps comments by Louise and Fernando as well.
Yes, thank you, Eugenia, for that. I mean, it's very difficult to disagree with this. I know disagreements would be much more interesting. But I can only say that, indeed, we agree on that. I mean, the pluralism, yes, it's super difficult to, I think, define legally, but especially on the EU level. But I think, you know, the idea or the direction of travel is super simple. There, first of all, has to be transparency, and this is what we try to mandate on the EU level. Who owns what? Because it's not very clear in some member states who is particular owner of that newspaper or that TV. And with this, of course, if you don't know who owns what, it's also very difficult to fully understand what are the interests.
But sometimes it isn't just who owns what, it's who's on the board of directors of these companies and who's interfering that way.
No. I mean, but that's, you know, we have to start this transparency from somewhere, and this is one of the elements of the Media Freedom Act. So let's see where we end there. I mean, full support to investigative journalism, local journalism, another form of this, not maybe automatically profitable journalism. Here the Commission is trying to provide some funds. I think we also work with, for instance, with EURACTIV, but not only. And we want to have it more. We really want to have more money for cross-border, of course, cross-border projects, but investigative journalism and things like that. On working conditions, I mean, this is, I remember visiting with Vice President Jourova, meeting journalist associations. Indeed, this is every association in many countries we were in mentions that. And this is something that I have to say, I don't know what can be done on the EU level with the working conditions of journalism. That's why we have focused on something also very important on the safety because of journalism when they are doing their work, because we also see, even statistically, that the risks for journalism when they cover protests, demonstrations, somewhere where the police and big crowds are involved.
And it's really getting worse.
Migration. I mean, exactly, that's my point. It's getting worse.
If you look at what Reporters Without Borders are saying about 2022, also because of the Ukraine war, you know, those who are detained has gone up 13.8%, 57 killed this year. I mean, obviously, as I said, the war in Ukraine has had an impact in all of this. But does that point to media freedom in the EU being at an all-time low?
I mean, how do you measure that? I think where we are worried about is the trend, that it indeed is getting worse rather than it's getting better. And that's why we have to work on this. But it's the member states, and this is, Eugenia pointed to this, it's really the member states that have to pick up the baton on this and do more. And this is what we try to encourage them with the recommendation on safety, which is like we also work with the media sector on this, what should happen for this to work. But I wouldn't say, it's all-time low, it's very dramatic. I think we still have good media in Europe. We have a great tradition of the public service media in Europe.
No, we have good media, though.
So,
I think the bigger issue is what is being done to them and the journalists who are feeling more scared about the kind of work that they're trying to do these days. In fact.
Exactly, and the EU wants to be on their side, and I hope that we can find a solution to be on their side.
Okay, thank you very much. Eugenia, let me just come to you quickly. The Media Freedom Act, you've heard a little bit about it. Do you think it's a farce or a game changer?
I would say it's a good start. I think that a lot of the provisions are very necessary. It's a long time coming, especially in terms of protection from slaps and the safety of journalists, transparency of ownership. All these are measures that had to be taken to protect journalism. I think where the Act is perhaps less developed is in terms of supporting professional journalism. I think one of the biggest threats to media freedom comes because the business model of journalism has been eroded by platforms. This is the problem here. And this is where how I would respond to your previous question, that we see a paradox here, that more people than ever have access to publishing, but at the same time, professional journalism has been compromised because its basic business model has imploded, basically. So because of this, serious journalism can no longer function in the same way that it was able to 20 or 30 years ago. And the Media Freedom Act cannot do anything about this because ultimately, again, like journalism and media organizations are regulated by the market. Is there anything we can do to support them or to place them outside the market through perhaps a subsidy system? I don't know, but perhaps this is a question that we also, or an issue that we also should be put on the table. I mean, it was mentioned that the news industry is not like any other industry. So therefore, on this basis, maybe we can think about developing ways of subsidizing journalism because its function, socio-political function, is crucial for Europe. It's crucial for our countries.
Okay, Louise, you're taking what Eugenia just said. And is there also a role then? I mean, she was saying that that tech has essentially eroded the rights of journalists, I believe. So is there a role that tech can play in all of this to help journalists or media organizations?
Yeah, definitely. And first of all, I would like to say, it's hard to say if media freedom is at the lowest point, but I would say like in modern time, we've seen, yeah, it's really bad. And even though when I'm speaking like from a Swedish and Nordic perspective, we see that they are in like the top position in this press freedom index that the Reporters Without Borders are publishing every year. But even though we see new kind of threats that we're talking about, for example, the biggest newspapers in Sweden are talking about, hate speech against journalists, and that the police are not taking it serious enough. So the newspapers have to pay for security by themselves, and that's a big threat. That even though like the best countries in the world, there's still a problem. Let's just think about how it is in the worst countries in the world and how the problem is over there. And regarding like what the big techs and social media companies can do about it, it's all about design. Right now, maybe Twitter isn't our best friend anymore.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah, pretty sure about that. But social media such as Reddit is actually pretty good for journalists to use. So it's all about how these social medias are designed and how they could be used.
But talking about Twitter then, the infamous Twitter right now as it is, and the blue tick saga and everything that's been going on, you can't just, I mean, using Twitter as an example, you can't just, we've seen in the past, they've tried to ban certain personalities or former presidents, but banning people, banning content, I mean, that isn't a solution in itself, at least not long term. So what else could come in its place? Because you can't just keep saying to people, okay, this is harmful content, or these people are bad, they're inciting something, or they're being harmful to journalists. So what's the solution then? I mean, how can you help the media talk to, everyday people online in a forum that is constructive for both sides as well?
Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer, but I think transparency in any way possible. For example, now Twitter is taking away this verification symbol, and I think that you now will need to pay for that instead of, I'm verified that I am Luis Grabo and I'm this person, and the same with Elon Musk, he's that person. So that just makes everything harder. And the same for newspapers, for example, and for journalists. So that is not a good example. So more transparency and more information so we know who is who, and so we can have more of the free speech, I would say.
And then what about your ideas on the US sort of looking at or musing over this idea of an outright ban on TikTok? I mean, it seems bizarre that they're doing it, basing it on national security, but perhaps we know why. Is China such a big threat?
Oh, I'm not like a security expert, so I can't really answer that. But
But banning things like TikTok, do you think that's the way that we should be going or not?
No, I don't think so. I'm using TikTok a lot, and I think it's a great channel to get to meet new people. And getting out of your little bubble, so to say. And the algorithm of TikTok is very different from the other social medias. Now, of course, Instagram are trying to follow. So I think that is not the right way to go. And there we should rather have regulations. Of course, it's hard to regulate when it's a Chinese company, but I think we should look at other ways to do it.
And Fernando, then, you've spoken a bit about the Digital Services Act, putting obligations, I think you said, on big platforms and search engines. Just talk us through a little bit about that, then.
The obligations placed on them that I consider relevant for media or for democracy?
On platforms and search engines.
Yes, sure. First of all, back to the point on banning accounts and banning someone, I try to stay away as much as possible from US politics just to preserve the little sanity I have left. But I recommend that strongly to everyone else. You can feel an improvement after a couple of weeks. Essentially, something that I think that's pretty good in the essay is terms and reference of platforms must be fundamental rights aligned. So until now, we have had essentially an understanding that terms and references, terms and conditions, as well as the implementation of them, were up to the platform itself to decide. Something that I think is particularly interesting is this. Does this mean that we need to go for some form of freedom of speech absolutism where people cannot be banned? Not at all. I think we understand in Europe that freedom of expression can be restricted in very specific circumstances, including protecting the rights of others. If you are using a platform like social media to incite violence and coordinate an assault on democracy, probably you should not be allowed to use social media. Of course, these circumstances must be, the strongest possible safeguards must be provided to ensure that any type of action is proportionate to the need to protect the rights of others. But the protection of rights of others needs to be there. What I would like to do is to go back to the point raised by Eugenia, because I think it's at the core, and it's very little discussed despite of being at the core, which is how we ensure sustainability. Let me ask a slightly malicious question. Why regulate media that might not be sustainable in 10 years? But without sustainability, we don't have anything to regulate at all. And we are asking about subsidies, but subsidies reproduce the system we have currently of donations. The problem we have had over the last 20 years, when the revenue of newspapers has gone from selling print editions and having ads printed on them for which they would get most of the revenue, to having very little subscriptions online and getting a very small amount of their of the ad revenue, is that of course they are not sustainable anymore, and then we don't have media pluralism, because we have less and less media, and we have less quality media because newsrooms have less resources. So is the solution to these subsidies? No, the solution to this is addressing an obvious market failure. That is that we have a lot of media, but we have a very few key monopolistic players that happen to be big tech platforms that keep most of the revenue that goes to newspapers. If Google is getting 80% of the money for an ad that appears in Le Monde, probably Le Monde will not be sustainable in 10 years. Google will certainly be. We have action in Australia that we are not particularly fans of. There is more promising action in Canada, but fairness in the allocation of revenue from ads is absolutely essential. And everyone is talking about the big brother, which is the European Media Freedom Act as such, but the European Media Freedom Act comes with a small sibling, which is a recommendation by the Commission too. And in this recommendation, there are 4 points asking news media companies to become more sustainable through various actions. But probably the key to the sustainability is not within themselves, it's in their relations with the online platforms that keep most of the revenue.
But in which ways are they being sustainable or being asked to be sustainable?
If someone has access to it, but they asked to explore new revenue models based on microdonations, they are asked to explore new forms of shared subscriptions. They are asked to explore economies of scale through cross-border managerial initiatives, etc., etc. But what I point out exactly is that beyond these recommendations addressed at the news media companies themselves, we should be issuing recommendations, if not hard law, at big tech to make sure, just like it will happen in Canada. Canada will establish that news media must receive a minimum percentage based on negotiation between the news media and the online platform of the ad revenue. So if someone is buying an ad to appear on the website of a newspaper, a minimum percentage, let's say 40, 50, whatever, will go to the newspaper. The current model we have in Europe is that a newspaper might get 5, 10, 20%. Particularly big ones, big media companies get more. Smaller newspapers get even less. How can we have media pluralism under these market conditions? We need to address the market failure at where it is, which is a competitive market on the side of news media, but a monopolistic market on the side of big tech. So we need to rebalance power in that market to protect democracy, of course.
Okay, well, there's also a question for you from Gwenelle. She says, regarding the political ads proposal, you said that it should be up to big tech to correctly identify political ads. But what about putting the responsibility on the sponsors of such ads to declare their political nature instead? They are the ones with the most information in this case. What do you make of that? That was for you. Yeah, political ads.
Notwithstanding the obligations on the sponsors have a primary obligation, and that's the way it's written in Article 5 of the proposal by the Commission. So everyone who's buying an ad should declare it, and happens to be political, should declare it as such. But that's the model we have offline. When a political party, on someone running a political ad on a TV, went to the TV station and said, hey, I want to run this ad, it happens to be political, here's my disclosure, of course. But this is notwithstanding the TV station, in that case, to check the ad before running it and saying to this actor, okay, you're trying to run a political ad over my TV station, but you haven't declared it. So please, do this, otherwise I'm not running it. This is exactly what we need online too. Of course, the primary responsibility remains on the sponsor. But there is a subsidiary responsibility on service providers if they happen to care about free and fair elections at all, of course.
Indeed. Okay, well, I think we only have a few minutes left, so let me go around the panel now and ask you for your sort of key takeaways. I'll start with you, Mr. Wojcik.
Key takeaways.
Key takeaways from the discussion of the first panel we've had so far.
All right.
Your immediate thoughts. You've got quite a few. I can see you scribbled a lot.
Yeah, I scribbled a lot, yes, and surprisingly even on the topic of this discussion. I think the first takeaway. I mean, let's start from the end. So, what should be the obligations of online platforms? So I think I take from this that they have to respect the law, whichever the law is. And ideally not only in the letter, but also in spirit, because quite frankly, a lot of things that came after GDPR came from the fact that, yes, they implemented GDPR, but...
How do they do it?
But with the kind of, to minimize the risk of going to court, but not fully embracing what is that supposed to be? And that's the second thing that they're supposed to do, understand and accept their own responsibility and their own powers. And 3, translate this into their own policies. And this is the question of banning or not banning. I mean, that's the point. There shouldn't be that debate. You know, if you meet, there should be conditions when person or account should be banned. If these conditions are met, the account should be banned. It shouldn't be case-by-case scenario, regardless whether you're president or whatever, EU official or just a user of Twitter or whatever, not Twitter, but I mean, okay, Trump was banned on Twitter. That's why I thought of Twitter. I fully agree that the market is not fair when it, I mean, not fair, it's biased or tilted towards the big tech. They themselves say they don't produce the content, and yet they seem to get the most revenue from this content. Part of the solution was supposed to be copyright law that is operational. I mean, I think the jury is still out there, but it's clear that it hasn't remedied the situation to the extent that nothing else should be done, or at least not yet. And sometimes even, you know, Google, for instance, as a result says, okay, so we're not going to show advertising from some newspapers in some countries, and so then there is even less actually revenue for the media. So that's definitely not.
I think that's a really important point that was made, because if the organisations, the media organisations, don't have the ads, essentially they have to fold. Essentially, that's what happens then.
I mean, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm a civil servant, not a CEO of a media company, so I really would feel not qualified to tell media business how to run their business, whether it's subscription, whether it's ad, or whether it's something in the future. I think it's clear that digital reality is here, and the media, the traditional media, will also have to, I mean, must today adapt to this new reality. But I think indeed we want to help. I have doubts whether subsidizing is the way to go as a sustainable solution, as Fernando would put it. But we have to look at this. We have to be very clear that media, I think, you know, the way we understand democracy today, we need the media, and we need various types of media, not to just repeat free and pluralistic, but just to those who represent different point of views. But I think, you know, on our side, there will be legislation, or there is legislation. There has to be enforcement, and I think this we didn't talk about. But I can only say at the end what I said at the beginning of this panel, that, you know, Eugenia and her colleagues identified, I think, very good summary of what needs to be done. So it's, you know, more pluralism and better defined, investing in journalism, and having working conditions, because, you know, if indeed it will be paid very badly or not at all, then who will work there, you know? So that's I think these 3 should be our guiding things, and then we can discuss the tools to achieve that.
Indeed. Louise, your thoughts? But also I think a lot of the discussion is focused on essentially the bad things that the media does, but there are many good things that journalists do, and they are under threat.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I have nothing more to say around this, because I think Wojciech was really putting it all together.
Comprehensive,
and framed it very well, so I have nothing more to say right now.
Any last thoughts, Fernando?
In relation to media,
yeah.
I would highlight the point that this is something that has already been hinted at, but just looking at it from a very market perspective, the problem with media is that it's a very special market for 2 reasons. First of all, it produces a public good. Mm-hmm. It produces a good that does not only benefit whoever pays to read an article or see a documentary.
Well, the public good it does is providing information. That's what a journalist does every day, whether you like it or not.
It's providing regulation, and something we often forget in the spirit of what the single market is. It allows a single market to function, because without proper information circulating, companies cannot operate in a context where events are not discussed, events are not reported on. It provides the intelligence. It's very much the fabric of our society in this sense. The second one, I think 1 year ago we had, if I recall correctly, Vice President and Commissioner for Competition discussing a case of a merger of media, saying this is essentially a market like any other. And the idea there that we are just looking at the market structure purely, and its criteria you can apply to a merger between two news media companies is the same as whichever company producing pesticides. And the shift in paradigm to say, no, we must look at the impacts on the market structure, and we must look at how this will impact media pluralism, because actually in some cases it might enhance media pluralism. In some others it might hurt it pretty bad. So including this perspective, it's a very welcome shift. Let's see how to best structure this, because of course there are two different languages, the language of competition and the language of media pluralism. And how do we combine the findings of an assessment on the market structure with an assessment on media pluralism? That is going to be difficult. So it's a very welcome shift. The shift is quite revolutionary, if I may say so, but we have a lot of work ahead in finding the best way to structure and to make it work together, the media assessment, the media pluralism assessment, and the market assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. And then Eugenia, your final thoughts on media freedom.
Well, I suppose, like, for me, the takeaway from this discussion is that it is imperative to address the whole political economy of the digital public sphere. And that's what needs to be done as a next step. And if there is a reconciliation necessary between what Fernando referred to as the market assessment and a pluralism assessment, then this should take place within a broader kind of like understanding of how the political economy of the digital public sphere works. So if you have corporations having monopoly over the distribution of information, and they're in an antagonistic relationship with the producers of information, then something must be done to kind of like bring them in a more kind of like, well, a symbiotic relationship, as we mentioned in our recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugenia. Okay, well, moving on to our second panel then. You know, we were discussing the other role as well of not just the media, but of social media, which sort of nicely segues into another pillar of EDAP, countering disinformation. Now, as you were hearing, so many different actors are going to vie for power in a democracy, whether they're domestic or foreign, and they will look to influence, in some cases, even destabilize. Now, this can, of course, erode trust in democratic processes and institutions, including the media. It can put elections at risk. It can put perhaps not the best person in power. It can prevent citizens from making informed decisions and impair freedom of expression. So is the European Democracy Action Plan actually helping to counter disinformation? Well, to kick off, I'm going to go online. You can see her on our screen, Jana Kazaz from Globsec. Please go ahead for your key recommendations.
Good evening. So one of the main recommendations that came out of the workshop we had in Bratislava on November 8th on countering disinformation is that global tech companies should continue deepening cooperation on all levels. What we mean by that, and we have three components of it, is that first, global companies should continue developing a close working relationship with all stakeholders, especially with fact-checkers, researchers, and civil society organizations such as we are, Globsec. And we have to say that the basis of this cooperation were already put in place by Code on Practice on Disinformation. Second element is that global tech companies should ideally start to communicate and cooperate with each other also when it comes to take down more efficiently illegal, harmful content that is being spread across various social media platforms. Once there is a harmful content identified by trusted flaggers on one platform, it should be not accessible on others. And lastly, global tech companies should establish dedicated teams with native speakers serving as a point of contact for respective countries and thus replicate this working relationship that was currently established on EU level, also to national levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, Wojciech, I'm going to come to you again for a reaction to what Jana just said.
I mean, I think all these recommendations, because the code of disinformation, the anti-disinformation code, essentially has been upgraded now, and from September it's a new version, and I think it's exactly also the cooperation with civil society. These are very important features on this one. I think especially the national languages, we see that now with pro-Kremlin disinformation on Ukraine. I mean, it's very easy to see also by the opinion polls how, in Slovakia, in Romania, in Bulgaria, or in France, it's a very different type of narrative that they're using, because they're smart, they know who are they talking to, they know their audience. And it's sometimes shocking to hear from authorities of these governments that, whatever, Facebook would have one person dealing with this. And, you know, it takes a week, of course, to even respond to question. So this was really something that my boss also has insisted on every meeting with the tech senior executive, like, you know, it cannot be only English, it cannot be Europe-wide data, it has to be specific if we want to understand what's really happening and tailor our response accordingly, you know. And I think one of the, I mean, for us, for me personally, I think one of the biggest achievements of the code is creation of this ecosystem that Jana was talking about, because we really want to avoid having anybody, whether it's the Commission, the national government, or Mark Zuckerberg, deciding what is truth or not. That we cannot have that. So how in democracy, how can you do that? It's indeed through this collaboration between fact checkers, civil society, big tech, and I think this is the biggest value of this code. And indeed, the idea is to elevate it to much higher degree and to support the fact checkers, the civil society, the EDMO structures, and everybody around, so it becomes, you know, it can fly even higher. One thing, yeah, tell me.
One question on what
Sure.
you said about truth. Isn't it the problem nowadays that everyone has their own idea of what the truth is, and isn't that also perhaps an area where you have this discontent amongst people?
Yeah, I mean, you may be right. I also think that's one of the biggest problems today, that the middle, so-called middle, is smaller at the expense of extremes on the both sides. And this is a problem for us as a society, because when you're in the middle, you can talk to each other and disagree better. So for me, we essentially lost the ability to disagree with each other in some sort of civilized way. And I mean, okay, and this is a much longer debate whether the social media and these bubbles and amplifications of seeing more of the same content have contributed to that or not. I think it did, but whether it was a decisive feature or not, this is a different story. I mean, how to counter this? I mean, it's extremely difficult, I think, because indeed, I think it's also lost of this authority. You know, I remember when I was a child, my parents, everybody, you know, would watch the evening news channel, and that would be the discussion the next day. Today, you can watch, you know, and this is not bad, it just, you can watch completely different news, not even in terms of take on an issue, but just completely different issues. And then this social discussion, of course, cannot happen if you don't have common reference points. But hey, this is much bigger discussion. I think if it comes to disinformation, I would say one more point I would add to what Jana has pointed out. It's demonetization. And because, okay, fine, the Russians or other state actors, they don't do it for the money. But there are those out there who do it for the money. And it's too easy. It's too easy and too cheap to design it and do it for the money. So, you know, as I said, in January, this is the first test case of the new disinformation code. DSA is kicking in. So let's hope that this is a revolution. But, you know, we have to wait to see the results of these two instruments before we know for sure what will be the direct outcome or impacts of this legislation and co-legislation on the reality.
Okay, Fernando, can a disinformation code actually work, given that society is so polarized?
I will reject the premise. We have a wonderful study by Reuters Institute for Journalism from last year, explaining how even the country in the EU, which might be more similar politically and sociologically to the US, which is arguably the UK, it's very different in terms of disinformation and polarization from the US, how we see that actually the drivers of polarization and disinformation in the US, extreme, very hard partisanship with very weak parties and a presidential system is something we don't have in Europe. So the first thing I would worry about, let's see the US as a threat in the horizon as a model, but let's not draw inferences too quickly from the US, because certainly the situation in Europe is very different from the US. But from here, I think that the code of practice will actually become a code of conduct, right, under the DSA. So there is room for that, so it will actually become more binding, and it will work together with the DSA. And what I think is very important in the DSA is, again, the DSA is a brilliant exercise in safeguarding fundamental rights. As far as I know, there is not a fundamental right not to be exposed to this information. There is a bunch of other fundamental rights, and we must fight this information in a way that is complying with fundamental rights. How we do this, actually combining the code of conduct with, the code of practice, sorry, with the DSA. And the DSA says, okay, of course, take certain action upon receiving notices, but with a bunch of safeguards, so that there is an out-of-court dispute settlement, there is the notice and action mechanism, of course, but there is also a statement of reasons, so that platforms do not take action without explaining why, or without having a copy and paste message that they use 1 million times per year, where they always gave the same reason. So this is exactly why the DSA is so relevant combined with this, because we have a system where we recognize, okay, there is a bunch of different rights of different people that need to be balanced out. So in this sense, yes, it can work, but it must work for this.
But let's just, pare it all back a bit. I mean, it's great that the EU, of course, has all of these tools, but if I'm an average person going on the internet, I don't know, there's an election in my country in the next few weeks, and I want to learn about who the political parties are, who the individual candidates are, what are they doing in my area. I mean, how am I going to go online and find the actual truth? How am I going to inform myself without being manipulated with complete disinformation?
I suggest we go back to the previous panel by having plural and quality trustworthy media, that it's sustainable and does exist in our societies. But back to this, I think it's not so much about what we must demand that social media does, social media platforms do, but ask them to refrain from doing what they are doing. I will quote Frances Hogan in testimony in the European Parliament. The main driver of disinformation is Facebook's algorithm. Facebook's algorithm recommends content based on engagement. Disinformation and polarizing content happen to be engagement driver. You click on it, it's interesting, you spend time watching it, it releases hormones in your body and you want to stay on the platform and get more of that.
So but that algorithm's amazing for them, and that's the whole point of it.
Exactly,
so
the problem is how we reconcile the societal interest of not having the revenues of a company drive the informational space. And of course, here there is a need of reconciliation too. We have a lot in the DSA on recommender systems, actually. People can opt out from engagement-driven recommender systems. But for instance, now we have an initiative in the Council of Europe that is very interesting, which is the idea of a healthy news diet. Something that recommender systems could do is not only that they feed very little actual information, but when they feed information coming from news media that it's ideologically aligned with the user. We could have recommender systems that feed news media covered from different angles. So people would actually be informed, receiving links to news, to articles by different news media. If I'm always getting articles from The Guardian and I never get an article from the Telegraph, even though I follow both of them on Facebook, well, I think that impairs my informational space. And this is exactly what the Facebook algorithm is doing. YouTube algorithm, of course, to Twitter, as per their own internal research, too. So that's what I see. Actually, I think probably we shouldn't be asking them to do more, but we should asking them to refrain from doing what it's actually harming and the role they are playing. They are not creating this information. They are just making it much more appealing and much more visible.
Okay, Louise, your thoughts? Is Big Tech helping or is it hindering?
Well, I think it's hard to differentiate like newspapers and social media, because I think they will more and more like grow into each other, and like in the future we might even not see the difference, and maybe there will come up news media that will make their own social media platform. So it's hard to put them against each other, because I think they should rather collaborate, as we've said that before. And coming back to like social media, I would say it's like, yeah, it's the new open square. It's where we meet. So it's where we get our information. It's not like, yeah, I'm born 1993, but I guess before that, when you met on Sundays in the church, and you, this is longer before that, but you met there and you got your news there, like what's happening in my area, in my little town, before we had the news, before we had social media. And now this church or this local square is on social media, and we need to accept that. We need to make it a good place to be on. And it's talking about like free speech now, maybe they're all coming into each other, but it's a difference between writing anything on social media, getting a lot of likes, getting a lot of you're shown around the social media, even though it's TikTok, Twitter, whatever. But it's different if you're having an anonymous account and you're getting your voice amplified by the algorithm. So there should really be a difference here, I think. And we've seen that of different social media where accounts that are not verified, that we don't know who they are, and they are spreading disinformation. And we can't really do anything about it. So
okay, but do Gen Z? I mean, you're from Gen Z. Do you realize that, or do younger generations realize that when they? I mean, obviously, online. Being online is the way of the world now, and it's how younger generations have been brought up. They haven't been brought up with physical newspapers and things like that. But when they're going online, are they realizing that there is disinformation out there?
I think sometimes maybe the younger generation are better in understanding this than the older generation. Sometimes you see people sharing things on Facebook thinking it's real, and you're like, oh no, what is this?
But that is the space where they go now, I mean, generally speaking. So do they believe that the information also that they are viewing online, younger generations, do they believe that that information is also fit for purpose?
I think it's different all over Europe. I don't really know how it works, but in schools, for example, in Sweden, it's very much focused on learn how to engage online. But of course, it could be much better. I had something else around that, but now I forgot it, so I will come back to that.
Okay, well,
can I
yes,
just
please,
very,
go ahead,
very quickly, because I think it's, I don't know whether I fully agree with this aspect, with two aspects. First of all, the difference between the social media and media is one produces content, the other doesn't. And it's very clear difference, because professional media obey to some standards. Like, for instance, you have to verify the news in two sources. And among many others, and that's where the difference comes from. Social media, Facebook, doesn't have its own content creators, because it's the people, we are the people who create the content there. So it's essentially an empty sheet of paper where people fill in with space, and that is a very important difference. And that also is some of the problem that we as users of social media should be able to distinguish who is producing this content, because indeed seeing an article from The Guardian could be something different than seeing whatever, a picture created by me, you know, which
if it comes from the media, it's generally a verified source. And
another thing, it's not a public square. It's social media. This is what they were trying to tell us, that that's why they shouldn't be regulated, because they're public square. But they're not, because the way algorithms work is they're actually dividing this and taking us from the public square and putting us to discussion clubs, but people with very similar views. Indeed, in the past, I could, if I was running for a candidate or had an issue, I could go. I still
you
can
don't
go
seem
to
like you
today.
agree with me. No,
you
she's crinkling her face. Go ahead,
because on public square you could say and everybody could listen. And today I can design my message.
But not everyone has a voice in the public square. Only the biggest voices have a voice on the public square.
Sure, but you could hear what others are saying. So if I go out in the center of Brussels and start shouting, "You're a thief," you will hear that. If I do it on social media and I pay for it,
but what I would say about an algorithm
vouchers,
is you can always try to beat an algorithm. You can, I mean, for example, if you just like cats and rainbows, then the algorithm is just going to show you that. But if you actively then try to change your algorithm, you will then be, or you start to search for different things, go into different spaces, you will then be, able to see all kinds of information. It's just about how you, as a user as well, use the tools and how you engage online, which is important.
Yeah, sure. I'm just saying social media, because they're driven by algorithm, it's not a public space. It's not a public square, sorry, it's a public space, but it's not a public square principles. And that's why we regulate it, because if it was, DSA is exactly about that, is to bring the principles of the public square debate into the online world. And that was the reason, the main arguments against the regulation from social media companies, they were saying two things. We're a public square, so don't judge us what is out there. And second, we're just the pipes, you know? Like, I mean, we're not responsible even for the sewage that goes through it. So these are really this is, you know, they lost this argument, and we shouldn't be supporting their argument that they don't put out there anymore,
I mean,
you know?
we're not supporting that argument. I mean, obviously, everything needs regulating, whether you're social media or the media.
Not everything needs regulating.
Well, maybe it's not all regulated. But then, for example, if you see social media as a threat, which seems to be the case, how is, for example, the European Commission using social media to then engage with younger generations?
Badly.
Because they badly? Okay. Yeah. Well, how could you do better?
You should be on TikTok.
We should be on
a certain
TikTok.
commissioner is starting to be a proficient user of Mastodon.
Oh.
There you go.
Okay.
Just one.
Yes, go ahead.
Building up very briefly on Wojtek, because I think it's going to be the same point. It's not only about the standards. I completely agree with Wojtek on that point. But there is one notion that is already in the Audiovisual Media Directive that it's upheld and strengthened by the Commission in the ENFA proposal, which is editorial responsibility. It's not only standards, it's that there is someone taking responsibility. Journalism is a journalist adhering to standards, but an editor checking and an editor ensuring the quality.
I can affirm that journalists do have standards,
well,
and their editors and their producers and everyone within the chain adheres to the codes of practice.
Because as long as I know, a couple of years ago, last time I posted something on Facebook, I had no editor checking what I was publishing. And this is the very fundamental difference.
Well, then you should also think about the place where you're working at. Okay, we have a question from Gwenelle. She says, given the importance of fighting against disinformation online, what do the panelists think about Article 17 of the Media Freedom Act, which gives the possibility to any entities to benefit from advantage gained by VLOPs when it comes to moderation of their content? Perhaps that's your area of expertise. Oh, no?
I'm drafting a public statement on that, so... To start with, it's amending de facto the DSA before it comes into force. There are a couple issues with it. So it's welcome that, different to the DSA, it's a procedural rule, not a rule of substance very much, and that it's very nuanced. But there is a problem in Article 17.1 with self-definition of media. So anyone can declare to be media, platforms should accept it as a fact that anyone declaring to be media should be treated as media. And something that I'm completely... The Freedom House runs these reports yearly on freedom in the internet, freedom in the net. And they've been looking for over-removal or over-regulation of news media content. There's no over-removal in any EU country. I've checked the last 27 national reports. I couldn't find anything. So I don't think there is a policy. If I understand correctly, the Commission does a policy proposal because there is a policy problem. I don't see a policy problem specifically with news media content being over-moderated compared to any other content. So I do think, because the DSA is very fit for purpose and because the DSA is actually very good, particularly in this area, I don't see the advantage that Article 17 brings, but I'm open to being persuaded otherwise.
Article 17 came, it's the media and the publishers themselves that flagged this as a problem, you know. I mean, in some regulations, we try to capture the potential problems that will arise in the future. I mean, I hate this phrase, but we try to future-proof. But okay, you know, and this comes from the publishers themselves. And now, in the context of war, we hear Ukrainian media who had to go online, and Facebook is their internet, but Facebook have very strict own policies on depicting violence, for instance. So, because, you know, normally it should be for cats and dogs and good things, and that's fine. But how do you inform if Facebook becomes de facto your internet and your viewers are there, how do you show the massacres in Bucha and in other places when you cannot depict violence? So the only the idea behind Article 17 of the Media Freedom Act is to create an early warning system. So say, hey, you, Facebook, whatever. I mean, poor Facebook. I keep mentioning them as an example, but okay, they will survive. Hey, Facebook, before you remove the content, editorial content that, is subject to the standards we just talked about,
very much so.
have a channel of, give them an early warning. Say, hey, guys, you're violating my conditions. There's a yellow card,
you see that. You see that online, whether it's, a little video clip that you're going to see on any social media platform to anything you see on the website of a news channel. There is always this sort of little screen, this black screen that comes up, says viewers might find this information disturbing.
Yeah. I mean, but that's fine. The problem is that and this is, again, this is from these Ukrainian media themselves. They say, well, we are shut. We have, for days and weeks, we have no response to Facebook. Why did they shut us down? What have we done wrong? And this was their main source of revenue as well, given in the context, the war context we're in. And this is extreme case, but these complaints or these concerns have come from publishers, also not only Ukrainian, but others. So, I mean, again, I'm not a journalist, I'm not an owner of the media, so I cannot quantify it. But I think it's fair that we create this early warning channel as saying, still respect the DSA, of course, right? Implement your moderation policy, but treat the media a bit more special.
But isn't this already in the DSA when we...
If it was, we wouldn't be proposed it again.
But I of course, not in the same wording, but isn't it indirectly when in the risk assessments we are saying take particular care on freedom of expression, particularly by media organizations, we have it in 34 in a way. I think it's a very interesting debate going forward.
Fernando, if I may, I feel, and maybe this is a strong word I'm going to use, but I sense a little bit of hostility against the media from you.
Hostility against the media?
A little bit of hostility, yeah.
I do represent the media freedom organization, so I wonder.
But no, it's interesting because sometimes I think the media have a bit of a bad name, and perhaps the way in which, I don't know, it seems that the way in which we've spoken about, there's a little bit hostility attached, and perhaps that is how the general public sometimes views some sections of the media. I think it's fair.
I think I don't have any hostility towards the media, and I wonder what have I said that makes you think that, honestly.
Well, listen, look, I'm glad you don't.
But no, I do think throughout my intervention, I have been critical of the way media content is dealt with by online platforms, not the content of the media as such. And particularly think I'm arguing for, there's many people that are very happily saying, take down this information, may this include media content or not, and I'm precisely arguing no. In this euphoria about taking down this information, you're probably infringing on the rights of media. I think it's precisely the opposite.
Okay, good to know. Okay, we're a little bit over, so I'm going to go to Jana for some quick final thoughts.
Okay, I would like to react to something that you mentioned actually at the beginning, because for most of the part I agreed with what Wojciech was actually mentioning, but you were mentioning that there is like people have more types of truth and where is the truth and so on. So I would just go there and say that there is just one truth and there are many opinions, and we cannot touch opinions of people that they express. But we can fact check those opinions that are backed by information that are wrong, that are backed by facts that are actually wrong. And this is what we have fact checkers for, and this is where they come into picture and on social media. And together with platforms, they can actually take down the amplified opinions backed by misleading information. So this is what we are going for. Otherwise, people should be freely they should be allowed to express their opinions that they have, but we can fact check those that are actually backed by false information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana. Okay, we're going to move straight away to our third panel, which is election integrity and crises. Now, to use the words again of the European Parliament President, Metsola, she said, to those malign actors in third countries who think they can buy their way forward, who think Europe is for sale, you will find the European Parliament in your way. But is the European Parliament in its own way? There are lots of calls now, of course, for better scrutiny, better transparency of how the European Parliament works and MEPs to curb lobbying, etc., etc., etc. Given elections to the Parliament are coming up, what comes next for the European Union? Well, let's find out as we, of course, discuss election integrity and crises. To kick things off, you can see her on our screens, Elżbieta Solarczyk-Krosova, who's the head of regulatory unit at SEDMO. Please go ahead for your opening recommendations.
Is that the proposed EU regulation on the transparency and targeting of political advertising needs to create an effective transparency framework, which would include dedicated repositories of political advertising for the largest platforms, parallel to general advertising repositories that are required now by the Digital Services Act. Be carefully drafted in order to provide sufficient protection to the freedom of expression and not to become a tool for censorship. Any legal action aimed at removing certain disinformation should be examined and properly justified within a sufficiently long time without losing efficiency. And lastly, the system for taking down disinformation should contain checks and balances in order to minimize potential misuse of power. And authors of such disinformation should have the right to appeal.
Okay, thank you very much, Elżbieta. So what do you make then, Wojciech, of what Elżbieta has just said, and also about, she's saying regulation leads to more distrust by the public, does it?
I was just thinking about that.
Because it sounds a bit like a Brexiteer, I won't lie.
I mean, now we are, what, many years after Brexit, Britain is all deregulated and the trust doesn't reappear to the national institutions. So I guess, I mean, I'm being ironic about this a little bit because they haven't deregulated that much. But still, but I think that indeed the key issue, I think, from what Elżbieta was saying for me is trust. And this is not only trust to, it's in all the panels. It's how to have trust to media, societal trust to media, societal trust to the democratic institutions, societal trust to laws, and societal trust to one another, essentially, in order to do that. I mean, I think, you know, what the political ads repository, yeah, sure, why not? Good idea, and probably will happen. The discussion is how. On the disinformation points, I mean, we discussed that a little bit in the previous panel as well. So I think it's not even about the regulation, more regulation or less. I think it's about quality of regulation and our ability, okay, if it's European legislation, our common ability to explain to why are we doing this, is it needed, and what will be the effects of that regulation. And indeed, that's why I was trying to say that in democracy, when we are regulating around the freedom of speech, so disinformation, foreign interference, online space, and things like that, we have to find a democratic response to that. So indeed, no censorship, no ministry of truth, no one arbiter of truth, and things like that. But whether that will do the trick, again, I think this is also this request that came from me, that it has to be our common job, because that's also the issue with what you mentioned, that essentially there is less trust, maybe you said hostility towards the media, not from Fernando, but in general there is societal, I think, mistrust into the media that I don't agree with, you know, that there is interior motive behind why are they saying things that I don't agree with.
Well, also,
And that we
it's-
have to
it's-
try
it's-
to
It's
address
also a little
somehow.
bit about what you're saying about tribes as well.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that somebody will distrust the media, a blanket distrust.
No,
they
no,
will
not
only
blanket.
trust what
Exactly.
they believe based on
Exactly.
the people or
Exactly.
whatever that they actually believe.
Exactly. But I mean, there is no silver bullet to that, and I think we are aware of that. That's why we're trying this another quite ugly phrase, whole society approach. Starting from digital support for digital literacy and things like that. So we also, old people like myself can understand what happens online and what content is created where. But anyhow, this democratic resilience, it's so broad because it's from cybersecurity. I mean, anti-corruption measures you mentioned yourself. Although here it's just quite interesting, just last word, because I'm from Poland, but if I follow American politics or any politics and there is a corruption scandal, when somebody is caught, it's never the institution, right? It's not the whole Congress is corrupt, it's the Republican Party or Democratic Party. Here, somehow, interestingly, for the European institution, there's one MEP caught, and all of a sudden the entire institution, if not one, all of them are guilty of corruption. So it's quite interesting why
Allegedly.
this phrasing, allegedly.
Innocent until proven guilty,
But
yes,
it's
and
quite
so on.
interesting the framing of this as well, that this is the European Parliament is corrupt, whereas when an MP is caught sometimes on the national thing, it's specific MP from a given party. So
Well, I think it's also, I don't want to go too much into the details of the case because, as I said, it's an ongoing case at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think it's the scale of the kind of corruption. It's sort of come out of nowhere, essentially. It's not to say, no offense to politicians, it's not to say, I think we're all aware, wherever we are in the world, corruption exists, whether it's in politics or any other area. It's just the kind of scale of it. Out of nowhere, you've got someone talking about bags of cash and various foreign actors involved in the works or trying to influence what the European Parliament does. And I think that's the problem, is this idea of why were they trying to influence and who was trying to influence and how have they perhaps influenced what the European Parliament or was trying to do. And we don't obviously have.
But why the European Parliament? Why? That was my point. Why are you saying the European Parliament was trying to do? If they caught one MEP, the question is what they were paying her for, allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah.
Allegedly. Everything I say is
Allegedly.
Even if I
Yeah.
don't say the word allegedly, I mean allegedly. Why are they? Who paid her? Not the European Parliament. What did they want her to do? Not the European Parliament. I think it's super big distinction because you cannot just extrapolate to 700 people that are working there or like MEPs
But we don't know
and
if
thousands
it was,
of people.
For now, we don't actually know if it was just her. Other offices have been sealed. We don't quite know exactly what the situation is. And as I said, they're different state actors, different people saying, information's coming out. Is Morocco involved in it? Is Saudi Arabia? That's also another allegation. Is it Qatar? We literally don't know at the moment what is going on. There's just so many allegations going on around this.
But we know it's one MEP.
We do know it's one, and yeah, she does.
I don't want to undermine this. It was more narrative thing because this, it's great that Belgium, the fact that she was caught allegedly red-handed is great testimony of the actually how anti-corruption services work. That's just it's actually but this is also something we have to learn and learn from the crisis. And already President von der Leyen has indicated the work that we have started on this interinstitutional ethics body. We have to look at the transparency rules, whether they could be strengthened. There will be anti-corruption package coming later this year that was announced, during the State of the Union later this year, next year already, because we're at the end of this year, sorry. So there are elements planned that could improve the situation, and hopefully we will find a way to make it more difficult for those who are tempted to accept bag of cash, to be caught like they were this time. So there you go. I think the question is what can be done better, and what can be done more by the institutions themselves, and how to support the law enforcement agencies, police, and others across the member states, so they can do their job even better than they're doing
I mean,
now.
you say it's just one MEP,
Yeah.
allegedly, but the fact is that it's a scandal that has sullied the reputation of
Trust.
trust that people have in this one
back.
particular
Hostility towards the Parliament.
institution, and perhaps the EU as a whole. So, I mean, if an everyday person is hearing about this scandal, an everyday European, why should they still have trust in the European project itself? Does this one scandal, because it is such a massive scale, does it erode trust? Louise, perhaps you can take that one.
Well, I agree. It's a big scandal, and I think, for like normal people in Sweden, sometimes I think that maybe what's happening in EU isn't that well covered in media in Sweden. So that's maybe a bit of criticism against media and the EU in Sweden. But I think this is very problematic for European institutions. But we need to remember that EU are bigger than certain politicians, and the European project is about ideas and visions. And the best thing about democracy is that when you're disappointed at the politician, you can fire them. So let's do that.
Indeed. And Fernando, what then can the EU learn? You've seen in its very good moments, the war in Ukraine, it really rose up to the task at hand. It's shown how well it can support Ukraine. But then also we have perhaps a worse moment we're seeing right now, we're living through right now, this whole Qatargate. So what can, the EU learn from all of this? And where does it go to now?
I will tie it, as it was done, to the idea of trust in institutions. And the points by Alberta were very on point. I work a lot on political ads, and I would have struggled myself to summarize that much and to concentrate so much in 1 minute. I would say that the issue is that in relation to elected institutions, we have two challenges that are interwoven but are nevertheless different. The idea of ensuring that elections are free and fair, and the idea that nevertheless those who lose them can accept them, so the idea of trust. And the idea that we can have actors at the social level, at the societal level, but actors at the political level who distrust the result of the elections, even if they are free and fair. So I think the Commission is very right putting forward this initiative on political advertising, because we need to ensure free and fair elections. And the moment ads go online, ads are very little regulated across the EU in member states, political ads online. So they needed European regulation. There was a response needed, particularly with the European Parliament regulation ahead in 2024. But there is the issue of trust. There is a very interesting ruling of the German Constitutional Court on electronic voting machines. They essentially said they are perfectly fine. They are safe, but people will not necessarily trust them. So even if they are safe, we shouldn't be using them, because we don't want to give people unnecessary reasons to distrust of democracy when we can just spend 20 minutes checking papers to see who voted for whom. It's not worth it saving 20 minutes if that is going to mean distrust on democracy. So I would invite, when thinking about political ads, which mechanisms we put in place. I will put Zuckerberg on here. Zuckerberg, in one of his famous speeches, he goes and says, we are here to disrupt everything. And probably democracy, here is, sorry for overquoting, but here is Hannah Arendt. I think one doesn't need to be a conservative to agree with Hannah Arendt in one point, that democracy relies on a minimum tradition. Whether we criticize it, what we do with it, but without a tradition, whether we accept it, criticize it, reinvent it, there is no possible democracy, because we need this minimum agreement, and these minimum agreements are things we inherit. So how can we actually regulate political ads in a way that now that political ads change radically, because they go from being on TV, from being on the radio, being on billboards, to being on screens, on your laptop, on your smartwatch, on your phone? How do we ensure a minimum element of tradition so that there is not only free and fair elections, but elections that citizens can trust the results of?
Okay, well, I have a question here from Adrian, based on what you were saying as well. Adrian says, democracy depends on having a healthy middle class. Average citizens hate politics, and the media because they feel big government and big tech go together. Why should citizens even trust big tech to favor inclusion? Anything too big and too powerful is bad for the middle guy. No. What do we make of that one?
They shouldn't trust big tech. Why would they? We don't need that trust to private sector to necessarily have healthy society. So that's no, I don't think so. I think what we need is the dose of skepticism towards everything we see around. I kind of have a feeling that too many of us are a bit too little critical about reality around us.
In what sense?
That we take things at face value, that's the point. I mean, why propaganda is allegedly, my new favorite word, thank you very much for
my
that.
My pleasure.
Is allegedly so successful because we believe in it, and I think with the dose of skepticism, maybe we wouldn't. The same when it comes to personal data usage of private companies. We're not bothered by it. If we were, maybe they would do it a bit less. So yeah, I mean, I don't trust them. I think it's not necessary to trust the big tech or any big company necessarily. I think they would benefit from healthy dose of skepticism from society.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree, but I think as long as you always talk about more regulations in here, and of course, that could sometimes be good. But I also see difficulty when we have big techs because they are really good in lobbying and they want regulation if they're formed their way. So I think the conclusion to all of this is that we should have more competition because in the social media market, we talked about like in a few years ago, yeah, Facebook is the biggest thing. All users, they're the hugest the company all over the world. But now we see they're coming in new social media companies. And I think we should strive for having more European social media companies. So then we need to open up the market and we need to say, we want more innovation, we want newer companies to compete with the big techs rather than just regulate it all and we'll just have the big companies.
Well, there's also a question which says, should we break up big tech like we did in the early 20th century in the United States? It seems like a slightly old-fashioned, outdated concept, but what do you think?
I don't think we need that.
It's more competition.
More competition is the
go
answer.
ahead,
I think we'll have it in 20 years. We often discuss big tech in a very superficial manner, which is horizontal competition. So Facebook having a different Facebook. The problem of Facebook is that it's vertical competition. Think about the electricity market. There are a lot of companies that go from the moment electricity is produced until it's delivered at your apartment. So there is someone producing it, there is someone stabilizing, there is someone that puts it in the grid, and there is someone ultimately even checking how much you have consumed or not. So there might be 4 or 5 companies since the moment electricity is produced until the electricity is delivered at you. Facebook or YouTube, what essentially they do is that they integrate vertically in the same way an electricity company could have the whole system. So they are hosting the content, they are giving you access to it, they are deciding which algorithm you have. You cannot have a third party. This is perfectly technically feasible. Having a third party, having a company different from Facebook, this do for you the recommending what will you see and not. And that's where we don't have competition. Probably we don't need a second Facebook. Probably we need a better Facebook. Let Facebook do hosting and let Facebook be a player in the recommender systems. But if we want competition and markets, why don't we break up? We have done this over and over again with good economic results in other sectors. We have prevented economic integration vertically. The problem is that digital world was very disruptive. Everything happened very fast, and we consolidated, and we are taking for granted as natural, exactly as Wojtek was saying. We take things at face value. We take it for granted that a company can have this huge degree of vertical integration. We wouldn't be allowing, sorry to go back to a stupid example, in pesticides. But we happen to allow it for social media. So I'm pretty confident in 20 years, we will get fed up that the DSA will deliver, but only to an extent. So will the DMA, but only to an extent. And then we'll look for solutions and we'll go for the obvious. Split them vertically.
Okay, interesting. Okay, final thoughts from Elsbeta, please.
Okay, so I unfortunately didn't get the option to react on the reaction on the more regulation can lead to more distrust of the government. I would like to clarify a bit on that in that regard. because we actually, on the national level, we had research, sociological research that actually showed that sometimes people think that if a government is putting too much of national regulation in place with regard to disinformation, then the common people are afraid that this might turn very easily into the tool of censorship. So that's why we mentioned in our recommendation that this regulation, like a vast regulation, could lead to distrust, especially with the history of being a communist country in the former period. Then the law could be really misused. And I believe that it's still ingrained in the people who are afraid of this regulation that might be like going too far. So that would be the first idea. And secondly, I enjoyed very much your discussion about the political advertising and how to secure the integrity of elections. My last remark to that, I would say, is that I very much welcome the the proposed regulation on transparency and targeting of political advertising. The thing is that even though these are very good rules, I would like to say that there is no problem with those who are adhering to the rules. We need to have certain mechanisms in place for those who are not adhering to the rules. And there is this Article 9 of the regulation that speaks about indicating possibly unlawful political advertisement. This is a mechanism that is going to play very much into the trust of people and in the trust of society to companies and to those who are going to put those mechanisms in place. And I guess that the way forward, what we need to focus in the future is actually to define the best practices of indicating the possibly unlawful political advertising, because political advertising can have many forms, and we need to be prepared. We need to be ready to react on unprecedented challenges and to think a little bit as a criminal, if I can use the word criminal, it's like a metaphor, but to to think very creatively as marketing specialists who could really do political advertising in a way that is undetectable. So this is a big challenge forward, and that's my closing point.
Thank you so much. Okay, panelists, you have 10 seconds each for your final statements. So Fernando, 10 seconds, off you go.
Very much looking forward to the Defense of Democracy package.
Thank you. Louise?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this discussion. I think we covered a lot of topics, and I'm hoping that the Commission would not only focus on about regulation, but also how to make a competitive European market for social media companies and for the civil society.
Wojciech, will you do that?
Not everything is for regulation, and I really don't think so. We are obsessed in regulation, especially when it comes to the freedom of speech area or fighting disinformation. But I think, for me, that even if we have the best rules, they're as effective as its enforcement. And I think this is the future of the success of the DSA and other big pieces of legislation that's supposed to bring the fairness to the digital market.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, panelists. Thanks to everyone who's watching. I'm Mariam Zadi. You've been watching a EURACTIV debate supported by Microsoft. Thank you and Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thanks.